She looked like the Gulf had chewed her up and spit her back onto dry land. That was Odette Thibaudot's first thought when she turned around in the parking lot of her own restaurant and saw the woman standing there. Not sitting, not asking, just standing with the still, upright patience of someone who'd learned a long time ago that the first few seconds of being seen usually decided everything that came after. She was young, maybe 27, maybe younger if life had aged her early, which down here on the Mississippi coast, it usually did. Her sneakers were worn through at the heels, one sole flapping loose like a mouth that couldn't quite close. Her jacket was 2 sizes too big, sleeves rolled twice, with a hand-stitched repair along the left shoulder that was neat enough to suggest she cared, and frayed enough to suggest she'd done it more than once. She carried a single canvas backpack, faded to the color of dust, and nothing else. No car in the lot, no phone in her hand, no one waiting for her on the road behind, and she had that particular look in her eyes, not desperate, not hungry, just steady, a little careful, the look of a woman who'd stopped expecting doors to open but hadn't stopped knocking on them. Odette had just hung up on a phone call she'd rather forget. Her shrimp supplier had cut her off, 3 months unpaid, and the words "final notice" were still ringing in her ears like a church bell that wouldn't quit. She was 71 years old. She'd built this restaurant with hands that could still roll a roux in the dark, and she was watching it bleed out one invoice at a time. The woman wasn't looking at her. She was reading the menu taped to the glass door, but not the way a customer reads a menu. Her eyes moved from the prices to the ingredients to the layout the way an accountant reads a balance sheet, the way a mechanic listens to an engine and knows before the hood's up what's wrong underneath. Then the woman turned to Odette and said something that made Odette Thibaudot, who had not been surprised by a stranger in 30 years, go completely still. "You just lost your shrimp supplier. I know a place in Bayou La Batre that'll deliver fresher, 20% cheaper, and they don't ask for payment up front." If this story moved you, you'll want to hear what happens next. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single chapter. Drop a like to help this story find the people who need it, and share it with someone who could use a reason to keep going today. Odette looked at the girl standing in front of her and said nothing for 10 seconds. 10 seconds is a very long time when 2 strangers are standing face to face in an empty parking lot at 2 o'clock in the afternoon under the Mississippi sun in September. She was trying to find the trap. 30 years in the restaurant business along the Gulf Coast had taught Odette Thibaudot that when a stranger offered you something for free, either they wanted something far more expensive, or they were desperate enough that free was the only thing they could afford to offer. She didn't yet know which kind this girl was. "You know a shrimp supplier," Odette said slowly, not asking, only repeating it so she could hear it again in her own ears. "In Bayou La Batre. Fresher delivery. 20% cheaper. And they don't demand payment up front." The girl nodded. "I used to work for a seafood restaurant in Biloxi. My old boss bought from them for 4 years without changing suppliers. He said he'd recommend me if I ever needed it." "What do you need?" Odette asked, because that was always the real question. The girl looked straight at her, not avoiding, not embarrassed. "Give me 48 hours. I'll call them, negotiate the price, and arrange the first delivery. Free. No strings attached. If you're happy with the product, give me a 1-week trial at the restaurant. If not, I leave, and you keep the new supplier." Odette almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because this girl was standing in the middle of a parking lot, with one shoe sole split open, and offering a business deal in the voice of someone who had negotiated more times than her age suggested. "Why free?" Odette asked. "Because I need you to trust me before I ask you for anything. And I don't have anything yet for you to trust." That answer made Odette stay, not because it was clever, because it was true. She had heard enough promises in her life, from employees, from suppliers, from her husband when he was still alive, and she knew the difference between someone telling you what you wanted to hear and someone telling you what they truly thought. This girl belonged to the second kind, or she was better at pretending than anyone Odette had ever met. "What's your name?" "Jolie. Jolie Fontaine." Odette nodded toward the restaurant door. "There's a landline at the cash register. Make the call." Jolie stepped into the restaurant for the first time. She didn't look around, didn't stop to admire anything. She went straight to the cash register, picked up the phone, and called. 3 calls. In the first call, she asked after a man named Roy, her voice warming slightly in the way a person's voice changes when they mention someone they truly know, not just a name in a directory. In the second call, she talked price, her voice calm and specific, not bargaining like a tug of war, but negotiating by laying the truth on the table and letting the other side see it for themselves. In the third call, she confirmed the delivery date, 14 minutes total. She set the phone down and said to Odette, "Thursday morning, 6 o'clock, 30 pounds of brown shrimp, properly packed in ice, delivered to the back door." Thursday morning, at exactly 6 o'clock, a small truck parked at the restaurant's back door. 30 pounds of brown shrimp, ice done properly. Jolie had been standing there since 5:30, checking every crate, touching each shrimp with her thumb and forefinger in the way someone who knew seafood checked seafood. Quick, sure, without drama. Odette opened the crate, looked at the shrimp, looked at the ice, and smelled. Then she looked at Jolie. "1 week," Odette said. "After that, we talk." Jolie nodded. No frantic thanks, no extra promises, just a nod. And that was the whole contract between them. No paperwork, no signature, no handshake. Only a 71-year-old woman running out of options and a 27-year-old girl running out of road, looking at each other between the smell of fresh shrimp and the early morning light, and deciding that was enough to begin. Jolie had been at the restaurant for 4 days when the white health department car parked in front, without being invited. 2 inspectors walked in at 10 o'clock in the morning, one holding a clipboard, the other holding an industrial thermometer, and both wearing the faces of people who had not come for lunch. They crossed the dining room and went straight into the kitchen. 40 minutes later, they came out and left a 2-page report on the cash register counter, and Odette picked it up to read, then had to read it again, because the first time she couldn't believe her own eyes. The fryer oil filtration system wasn't working. The filter was caked with residue so thick that the inspector used the words, "fire hazard." The main cold storage was nearly 5 degrees above the allowed temperature, which meant everything inside was sitting in the zone where bacteria grew. The food safety permit had expired 4 months earlier, and no one had renewed it, probably because the old manager had left before that, and no one had thought to check. 72 hours. That was the deadline written at the bottom of the report. Fix everything within 72 hours or close. Odette stood in the middle of the kitchen holding the paper and said nothing. She had stood in this kitchen for 30 years. She had cooked in it when her husband was still alive, when her son was still small, when the restaurant was full every Saturday night, and the waiting list stretched all the way to the door. She knew every crack in the wall, every groan of the pipes, every sunken place in the tile floor worn down by 30 years of footsteps. But for the first time, she stood inside it and didn't know where to begin. Jolie took the report from her hand. She didn't snatch it, didn't ask permission, only gently pulled it away as though taking something the other person had been holding too long. She read it from top to bottom, slowly, then said, "You have 72 hours. I need the authority to call repairmen. The authority to sign invoices under $500, and a place to sleep right here in the restaurant, because I'm not leaving this kitchen for 3 days." Odette looked at her. "You've only been here 4 days. Do you want me to wait a full month before saving your restaurant?" Odette didn't answer. She only nodded once, then walked out of the kitchen, and Jolie began. In the first hour, she removed the entire oil filter system, 3 steel mesh panels so coated in black residue that the mesh could no longer be seen, called the nearest restaurant equipment store to order replacements, same-day delivery, a $60 rush delivery fee that she signed off on without asking anyone. In the third hour, she opened the cold storage, pulled everything out, checked every container, marked what could stay and what had to be thrown away, then called a refrigeration repairman. He arrived at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, opened the compressor, and said the refrigerant was nearly gone and the temperature sensor had been dead for a long time. Jolie asked how long the repair would take. He said tomorrow morning. She said tonight. He said it would cost more. She asked how much. He gave her a number. She signed. In the 8th hour, she sat at the computer by the cash register, filled out the online renewal form for the permit, attached photos of the inspection report, and wrote an explanation letter to the county licensing office. In the 12th hour, she slept. On the bench in the dining room, her backpack under her head as a pillow, her coat pulled across her stomach, Biscuit lying beneath the next chair and growling softly in his sleep as though objecting even in dreams. 3 hours later, she woke up and started again. The new filters arrived at 7 o'clock on the second morning. She installed them alone because the repairman had said he would come in the afternoon, and she couldn't wait. The cold storage was fixed at 10 o'clock on the second night, running at the correct temperature, and she taped a monitoring thermometer to the outside of the door and recorded the temperature every 4 hours. On the third day, she cleaned the entire kitchen from ceiling to floor, rearranged the storage area according to food safety standards she knew by heart, because she had worked in enough kitchens to know what inspectors looked for and where they looked. On the fourth morning, exactly 72 hours after the report, the 2 inspectors returned. They walked through the kitchen more slowly than the first time. They opened the cold storage, checked the temperature, looked at the new filters, and reviewed the pending permit file with a proper submission receipt attached. One of them wrote something on the clipboard. The other looked at Jolie, who was standing in the corner of the kitchen with machine oil on her wrist and dark circles under the eyes of someone who had slept a total of 9 hours in 3 days. "Passed," the inspector said, then added, his voice slightly surprised. "Highest score in the area this quarter." Jolie didn't smile. She nodded, waited until they were out the door, then sat down on the kitchen floor and closed her eyes for a brief minute. Only a single minute to breathe before lunch had to be prepared. News of the health department inspection reached Croix Thibodeau before the 2 inspectors had even managed to drive out of the parking lot. Trent Hebert called him, his voice flat as a tabletop, because Trent always said everything in the same voice, whether it was the weather report or the news that someone had just died. Trent was 40, broad across the body, flat-faced, the kind of man who stood behind decisions ordinary people didn't want to know about, and he monitored every asset tied to the Thibodeau family as a habit no one had asked for, but no one had told him to stop either. "The old lady's restaurant got written up," Trent said. 72 hours. Croix hung up and drove to Stillwater House. On the way there, he already had 2 names in mind. One person at the county office he had known since his father was still alive, and one person on the licensing board he had once helped with a small matter a few years earlier. 2 calls, maybe 3, and the report would disappear or the deadline would be extended, and everything would be handled the way the Thibodeau family had handled things for 30 years. Through connections, through influence, through the kind of power no one said aloud but everyone understood. He hated that way. He still used it. That was the contradiction Croix Thibodeau lived with every day, the way a man lives with an old pain in his back, not heavy enough to make him lie down, but never gone. He entered the restaurant through the back door, the same door he had used since childhood, because the front door was for customers, and he had never been a customer here. He walked down the hallway, turned into the kitchen, and stopped, not because anything was blocking his way, because the kitchen was clean. Not clean in the quick, careless way of someone sweeping over the surface just to be done, but clean in the way that meant every corner had been scrubbed, every rack had been rearranged, and the new oil filters were lying on the stovetop waiting to be installed, looking so bright they were almost insolent in the middle of this 30-year-old kitchen. A girl he had never seen before was standing in the middle of the kitchen with 3 repairmen, holding a marked checklist, sweat on her forehead, her dark brown hair tied high with a rubber band that looked as if it had been used for the 100th time. She was telling one of the 3 repairmen that the ventilation duct above the fryer needed to be cleaned, not just wiped on the outside. Her voice not loud, not commanding, but carrying the certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about and didn't have time to explain why she knew. Jolie turned and saw him. She didn't know who he was, but she knew he didn't belong in this kitchen. Not because of his clothes. He was dressed simply, in a dark shirt with no tie, no suit jacket, because of his hands. Long, slender hands, long fingers, clean, with no calluses, no cuts, no grease marks. The hands of a man who played piano or counted money, not the hands of someone who fixed stoves or carried plates. And on his left wrist was an old watch, its glass so scratched and cloudy it was almost impossible to read the time. But he wore it the way people wore wedding rings, not because it was beautiful, but because it was something that couldn't be replaced. "I'm in the middle of something," Jolie said. "If you can't fix anything, please stand outside the kitchen." She said it in the same voice she used with anyone standing in her way while she was working. Not rude, not challenging, only practical in the way of someone who didn't have a spare minute for empty politeness. Croix Thibodeau, a man whom far more professional, far more dangerous people paid not to be afraid, still had to think twice before speaking to, looked at this girl for a moment, then he stepped out of the kitchen. He stood in the hallway and didn't make the 2 phone calls he had planned on the drive over. He didn't need to call anymore. Someone had handled it another way, and that way didn't need him. It was a strange feeling, not unpleasant, just strange. like reaching out to open a door and discovering it had already been opened. When Jolie walked past the bar to go outside for a 10-minute break after the cleanup shift, Biscuit growled softly from the corner where he lay, the lazy growl of an old dog that had turned hating strangers into a comfortable habit rather than a defensive posture. Jolie didn't look at him, didn't bend down, didn't offer him her hand to sniff the way everyone else did. She only walked past. Biscuit watched her go with the offended look of a creature used to being respected through fear and not knowing what to do with someone who wasn't afraid. Following those intense weeks after the inspection, Stillwater House began to change deeply, rooted in the trust Jolie had built since her very first days. It changed because Jolie Fontaine woke up every morning at 4:30, walked to the fish market while the sky was still dark, and began talking to people this restaurant had stopped talking to long ago. Mr. Trosclair, who sold shrimp at the first stall in the market, was the first. Jolie bought 3 pounds of white shrimp from him on the second day, asked his name on the third day, and by the 5th day he had told her that his daughter had just given birth to her second child, and that the baby had jaundice. But the doctor said he would be fine. By the second week, Jolie knew which stall sold the freshest vegetables on Monday, which stall had soft-shell crabs on Friday, who would add extra scallions if you bought enough, and who named high prices out of habit, rather than because the product was good. She didn't bargain by squeezing people down. She bargained through familiarity, the way someone buys from the same place every day, and both sides know the relationship will last longer than any crate of fish. She changed the menu. Not completely. Odette would never have allowed that, and Jolie was smart enough not to suggest it. She kept the backbone, gumbo, po' boys, red rice, the dishes that had been on the menu since the day Odette opened the restaurant, but she added a what we have today section that changed according to what the morning market offered. Monday, fried soft-shell crab with lemon sauce because Mrs. Melancon's stall always had fresh crab at the beginning of the week. Wednesday, grilled redfish because Mr. Arsenault came back from sea on Tuesday afternoon. Friday, seafood soup because the market cleared out inventory before the weekend and Jolie could buy at the best price. The menu began to smell like the neighborhood instead of like a supplier catalog, and the people in the neighborhood noticed it before they noticed they were coming back. 3 old ladies came first, Mrs. Boudreau, Mrs. LeBlanc, and Mrs. LeBlanc. Guidry, 3 friends who had eaten at Stillwater House every Sunday for 15 years, until the food went downhill and they switched to the chain restaurant on the main road because at least there, the soup wasn't too salty. Jolie found their phone numbers in the old regular customer notebook Odette kept in a drawer, called each one, and invited them to come try a meal. Free. The 3 women came, ate, and didn't say much, but the next week all 3 returned and brought 4 friends with them. The week after that, 7 people came. No one advertised anything. It was only 3 70-year-old women telling their friends that Stillwater House was cooking well again, and in small coastal towns in Mississippi, the recommendation of a 70-year-old woman was worth more than any post on the internet. Then there was Jolene. Jolie didn't know her name during the first 2 weeks. She only knew she was the young woman who came on Tuesdays with a little daughter, always sat at the corner table near the window, and always ordered 1 serving of red rice with beans, then split it in half for the 2 of them. Tuesday was the cheapest day of the week at Stillwater House. Jolie saw that plate of rice split in half 3 Tuesdays in a row. On the 4th Tuesday, she carried out an extra bowl of soup and set it on the table for the mother and daughter. "Leftover soup from the kitchen," she said. "It'd be a waste to throw it away." It was never really left over. Jolie cooked an extra portion every Tuesday, just enough for 2 people, and she cooked it before the kitchen opened, so no one in the kitchen would ask why. Jolene looked at the bowl of soup, looked at Jolie, and said nothing. She understood. There are things people give that, if you have to thank them out loud, turn into pity, and pity is heavier than hunger. Jolie said nothing. Jolene said nothing. But every Tuesday, the mother and daughter came, and every Tuesday there was a bowl of leftover soup from the kitchen that was never truly left over. Late one night at the end of October, Jolie sat alone on the back steps of the restaurant, eating cold rice at 2 o'clock in the morning. No lights, only moonlight and crickets, and the smell of river water somewhere in the wind. The kitchen door opened softly. Biscuit came out, slowly, old and stiff, his nails tapping against the steps. He sat beside her, not growling, not looking at her, only facing the darkness as though he too had something to guard. Jolie didn't reach out to pet him. She only kept eating. From that night on, the dog didn't growl at her anymore. Croix Thibodeau visited his mother every Tuesday at noon. It was the only thing on his schedule that no one was allowed to move. No meeting, no call, no matter large enough. Trent knew that. The people who worked for Croy knew that. And Odette knew that if the day ever came when her son stopped coming on Tuesdays, that would be the day she would truly worry. He usually arrived at 12 o'clock, ate lunch with her in the back kitchen, talked for 20 minutes about things that didn't matter, because both of them understood that Tuesday lunch wasn't meant to solve anything. It was meant for each of them to know the other was still all right. Then he left. But today he didn't leave. Jolie noticed because she noticed everything connected to the operating rhythm of the restaurant. And a man staying at the table after lunch when he always left was a small change she recorded without comment. She cleared tables, wiped the counter, prepared the kitchen for the dinner shift. And when dinner hour came, Croy was still sitting there, having moved from the back kitchen table to the small table beside the window in the main dining room, his third cup of coffee in front of him, reading something on his phone with the look of a man who wasn't actually registered but only needed a reason to stay. Odette brought out 3 dinner plates. Not 2, 3. She set them down at Croy's table, pulled out a chair and sat across from him, then turned to Jolie, who was standing at the bar, and said, "Sit down." It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the voice of a woman who had raised a child, raised a husband, raised a restaurant, and knew that some conversations only happened when you made people sit at the same table, instead of letting them stand on opposite sides. Jolie sat. She sat at the edge of the table, her back not resting against the chair, like someone ready to stand at any moment if there was work to do, because for the past 9 years she had always been the one serving, not the one invited to sit. Odette began eating and began talking, naturally, without an opening, as though the conversation had already been happening before Jolie sat down. She asked Jolie about the winter menu, what they should switch to when brown shrimp went out of season, whether they should add a stew, because customers here liked hot food starting in November, and whether the new supplier would hold the price through the cold season. Jolie answered each question, specifically, without circling around, the way a person answered when she had already thought about the question before anyone asked. Then Odette turned to Croy, gently, like shifting the direction of the wind, and asked what he thought. Croy looked at his mother with the eyes of a man who knew he was being led somewhere but didn't object, because this was his mother. He said he didn't know anything about menus. Odette said, "You don't know anything about menus, but you eat here every week. You're a customer. A customer's opinion matters more than a chef's opinion." Croy looked at Jolie. "You've changed many things in 1 month. Only the things that needed changing. Where did you learn kitchen management?" Jolie set her fork down. "Everywhere I ever got fired from." The corner of Croy's mouth moved, only for 1 second, maybe not even a full second, so quickly that if you blinked, you would miss it, and then it returned to flatness, returned to the control he carried with him at all times, the way he carried the old watch on his wrist. But Odette saw. She always saw. 33 years of looking at her son, and she knew every millimeter of change on his face, and that tiny movement at the corner of his mouth was something she hadn't seen in a very, very long time. She didn't react. She only picked up the coffee pot and said in the most ordinary voice in the world, "More coffee, Croy?" Her voice was ordinary. Her eyes were not ordinary at all. The photograph was posted on a Saturday afternoon by Marcus, the 20-year-old prep cook Jolie had hired 3 weeks earlier because he was the only person who showed up to the interview on time. Marcus liked taking pictures of everything. The food, the bar counter, the shadow of the ceiling fan on the wooden floor. And that day he photographed Jolie standing in front of the stove, her left hand holding a wooden spoon, her right hand resting on the edge of the pot, her eyes lowered toward the simmering stock, with a focus Marcus thought looked very restaurant beautiful. He posted it on the Stillwater House Instagram page with the caption, "New chef, working magic," and 3 fire emojis. Jolie didn't know. She didn't use social media. She had no accounts, no Facebook, no Instagram, nothing at all. And that wasn't because she hated technology or lived in old-fashioned. It was 9 years of caution. 9 years of never leaving her real name on anything searchable. No photographs, no fixed address, no employee record kept long enough for anyone to remember. She had lived like someone deliberately refusing to exist on paper. Because if you didn't exist, no one could find you. And if no one could find you, the $14,000 debt your father left behind couldn't catch up. But for the first time in 9 years, Jolie had stayed in one place long enough for someone to take her picture and put her face online for the whole world to see. The place she had chosen to stop was also the place that made her visible. And when you became visible, the things you were running from could see you too. 1 week after the photograph, on a Wednesday evening when the restaurant was about to close, with the last 2 tables still drinking coffee and Jolie beginning to clean the kitchen, a man walked in. He didn't draw attention. That was the most noticeable thing about him. He looked like a retired accountant. A neatly pressed white shirt tucked into his pants, clean leather shoes, tidy hair, a forgettable round face with silver-framed glasses, and a patient smile, the kind of smile belonging to someone who could sit and wait for a very long time without ever seeming impatient. He sat at the table by the door, the one Jolie had just wiped, and ordered a bowl of gumbo and a glass of sweet tea. He ate slowly. He complimented the food to the server in a sincere voice. He left cash to pay for the meal down to the exact cent. And instead of a tip, he left a piece of paper. Jolie cleared the table, picked up the paper, and the world she had built over the past 4 weeks tilted slightly. Not collapsing. Not yet, but tilting in a way she recognized at once, because she had felt that same tilt many times before in many other cities. The paper was a copy of a debt acknowledgement, old and stained, with her name on it, her father's name on it, the number $14,000 on it, and beneath it, one handwritten line in blue ink, the neat handwriting of someone used to writing often. "Found you, Wade Pruitt." She didn't need to read the name to know. She recognized that smile before she recognized the paper, the patient smile she had last seen at the back door of a restaurant in Mobile, Alabama, 4 years earlier, when she had to quit in the middle of a shift and leave the city before the next morning. Wade Pruitt wasn't a bad man in the way movies painted bad men. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't slam his hand on tables. He only appeared, polite, patient, unhurried, with the debt paper and the smile and the absolute certainty that he had the right to collect what he was owed. And that was the frightening part. Not violence, but the limitless patience of a man who would never stop looking. Jolie held the paper. Her hand didn't shake. Her face didn't change. But Odette, standing at the cash register counting the money at the end of the day, looked over and saw Jolie's jaw harden. Not much. Only a little, the way a violin string tightens by half a note, a difference most people wouldn't hear. But Odette wasn't most people. She had been watching people for over 40 years, and that tightening of the jaw told her more than anything Jolie had ever said or had not said. It told her this girl was used to being afraid, and it told her this girl was so used to being afraid that she no longer let fear rise to her face, only into her jaw, into her teeth, into the place where she thought no one could see. Jolie closed the restaurant at 10 o'clock at night, wiped the last table, turned off the dining room lights, locked the front door, then went upstairs by the back staircase the way she did every night. Everything was like every other night. Except when she stepped into her room, she didn't turn on the light, didn't change clothes, didn't sit down on the bed. She pulled the canvas backpack from under the bed and began packing. Her hands moved without needing her mind to command them. 9 years of practice had turned this motion into reflex, the way a person pulls a hand away from a hot stove without thinking, the body remembering before the mind has time to interfere. The jacket 2 sizes too large with hand stitching on the shoulder, folded and pushed into the bottom of the backpack. 2 t-shirts, one bought at a Goodwill thrift store near Biloxi, one given to her by a former restaurant owner when she left a job in Mobile. Spare jeans, the shoes with worn soles that she still kept because she didn't have a new pair, a toothbrush, a small hardcover notebook where she wrote down recipes from every place she had ever worked, and a plastic envelope holding her papers, including an expired driver's license, a copy of her birth certificate, and the original debt acknowledgement she kept, the way people kept scars. Not because she wanted to remember, but because it refused to disappear. Everything she owned in this world fit inside one backpack. Exactly like the day she came here 4 weeks ago. Exactly like the day she left Mobile. Exactly like the day she left Pensacola before that, and Gulfport before that. 9 years, 7 cities, and every time it began with a backpack packed in the dark by hands that didn't shake, but didn't hesitate either. She zipped the backpack shut, set it on the bed, and was starting to stand when she saw Odette in the doorway. The old woman stood there in a long nightgown, silver hair falling loose over her shoulders, leaning against the doorframe with the weight of someone who had climbed the stairs at 10 o'clock at night at 71 years old. and her knees were reminding her of it with every step. She looked at the backpack on the bed. She looked at Jolie. She didn't ask where Jolie was going. She didn't tell her to stay. She didn't say that Jolie was important, that the restaurant needed her, that everything would be all right, that the debt would be handled, that this was her home now. She didn't say any of those things. She only said, "If you leave, lock the door for me." Then she turned and walked back down the stairs, slowly, steadily, without hesitation. The footsteps of someone who had lived long enough to know that holding on had never kept anyone. That if a person stayed because you begged them to stay, they would leave the day you stopped begging, but if they stayed because they chose to stay, no one could move them. The sound of her footsteps faded down the stairs and then disappeared. Jolie stood in the dark room with the packed backpack on the bed and that sentence in her head. Lock the door for me. Not, don't go. Not, I need you. Only, lock the door for me. As though Odette had accepted it before it happened. As though Jolie leaving was a possibility she had lived with since the first day. And all she wanted was to know that when Jolie left, the door would be locked properly behind her. Jolie didn't open the backpack. She didn't close it again. She sat down on the bed beside it, her back against the wall, her eyes lifted toward the ceiling where the old fan turned slowly with a tiny sound every rotation, a sound she had grown so used to hearing that if it stopped, she would wake. She sat like that until the first light slipped through the window. The light touched the wall, the ceiling fan, the blanket Odette had laid out for her on the day she moved into this room. An old cotton blanket washed soft, smelling of soap and wooden drawers, the smell of something that had been in one place for a very long time. The next morning, Jolie went down to the kitchen at 4:30. She opened the oven, turned on the stove, set the pot of stock on, and began the new day like every other day over the past 4 weeks. The backpack was still on the bed upstairs, fully packed, ready, but no one carried it away. Odette was already sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee when Jolie came down. She didn't look up, didn't ask whether Jolie had slept well, didn't mention the night before, never mentioned it again. And that backpack stayed under the bed from then until spring, unopened, unspoken of, like a quiet reminder that the door was always open if Jolie wanted to leave, and she still chose to stay. Jolie told the story the next afternoon, after lunch, when the kitchen had been cleaned and the restaurant sat empty in that quiet space between 2 shifts that restaurant workers called dead hour. She didn't wait for Odette to ask. Odette didn't ask. She only sat at the back kitchen table with her second cup of coffee and a plate of cornbread left over from lunch. And Jolie sat across from her, and she began to speak because she knew Odette had seen the debt paper on the table the night before, because she had seen the tightening of Jolie's jaw, because she had climbed the stairs at 10 o'clock at night, at 71 years old, to say one sentence, and then turn away, and all of that together meant she had known something was wrong before Jolie ever told her. And if Odette had known, and still let Jolie choose for herself, then at the very least, Jolie owed her the truth. Her father's name was Remy Fontaine. He fished in the bayou outside Houma, Louisiana, from a boat he had bought on installments when Jolie had just been born. Her mother left when Jolie was small. She didn't remember much about her mother, only the smell of cheap perfume and the sound of a door closing one morning. And after that there was only her father, and the boat, and the muddy brown water moving through the marsh beneath the Louisiana sky. Her father wasn't a bad man. He loved her. He taught her to cook, taught her to read the weather by the direction of the wind, taught her how to tie knots without looking. But he gambled. Not the heavy kind of addiction, not the kind where a man sold the house and everything in it. Only the steady, stubborn kind. A little every week. Enough for the debt to grow slowly like the tide, the kind you don't notice until it has already risen to your knees. When Jolie had just turned 18, a storm came into the bayou. Not the biggest storm of the season, but large enough that any fisherman with sense would have stayed ashore. Her father went out, because debt didn't wait for weather, because someone had told him that if he didn't pay before the weekend, it wouldn't be a polite conversation anymore, because he thought he had gone out in worse storms before and come back. This time, he didn't come back. Jolie told this part in a flat, quiet voice, the voice of someone who had told the story to herself inside her own head so many times that it had lost all its sharp edges, worn smooth like a pebble at the bottom of a stream, still heavy but no longer cutting. She inherited the boat and the debt. Selling the boat paid half of it. The other half, $14,000, had chased her for 9 years through 7 cities. And every time she began to settle somewhere, Wade Pruitt found her, and she left again before he could take the matter to court. Not because she didn't want to pay, but because $14,000 to someone earning $7.50 an hour washing dishes wasn't a debt. It was a sentence, and she could never earn faster than the interest grew. She finished speaking and added nothing more. No explanation, no request for pity, no, so that's why I am the way I am. She only told the truth, and sat there with it, as though placing something heavy on the table between them. Odette listened from beginning to end without interrupting. She broke off a corner of cornbread, ate slowly, and when Jolie stopped talking, she still didn't speak right away. She finished chewing the bite, took a sip of coffee. Then she asked, "How much is the debt?" $14,000. How much interest? I don't know exactly. Wade calculates interest his own way. Maybe it's up to 17 or 18,000 by now. Odette nodded, slowly, once, the kind of nod belonging to someone doing the math in her head. 14,000, she said, isn't a reason to run for the rest of your life. It's a reason to sit down and do the calculation. Jolie looked at her. She had prepared herself for many reactions: pity, anger, disappointment, advice, or the worst thing of all, the false understanding of someone who had never owed anyone a cent, telling someone who had owed all her life that everything will be all right. She hadn't prepared herself for math. Odette stood, picked up the coffee pot, poured more coffee for Jolie, and then for herself, set the pot down, sat again, and broke off another corner of cornbread, exactly the way she did every afternoon, as if Jolie had just spoken about the weekend weather instead of 9 years of running. And it was that ordinariness, that way Odette didn't turn Jolie's pain into an event, didn't make it larger, didn't make it smaller, only placed it beside the coffee cup and the plate of cornbread like something that could be solved with numbers instead of tears, that made Jolie feel, for the first time in 9 years, that maybe the debt wasn't as large as she had believed. Maybe it had only felt large because she had been running alone for too long. The Devereaux name had existed around Stillwater House long before Jolie Fontaine ever set foot there. Preston Devereaux, 56 years old, was the kind of man you never saw in the crime section of the newspaper, but always saw in the real estate section. He bought land. That was the simplest way to describe what he did, though the way he did it was not simple at all. He bought land in areas where other people had not yet seen value, or in places where the owners had grown too tired to hold on. And then he waited. He had bought 2 properties adjoining Stillwater House 2 years earlier, an empty lot to the south and an old warehouse to the east, and he had done nothing with them, only bought and held, like a chess player placing his piece on the board and then sitting back to wait for his opponent to make a mistake. Devereaux's target was not Odette, not the restaurant. His target was Croix Thibodeau. Croix had spent 10 years trying to separate the family empire from its criminal past, legalizing one piece at a time, and his mother's restaurant was the first piece. If Croix successfully separated Stillwater House, it would set a precedent. The next piece would be easier, then the piece after that, and once the entire Thibodeau empire was clean on paper, Devereaux would lose the thing he had used as leverage for years, the criminal shadow he could mention in negotiations, in board meetings, in whispers to the right people in the right places, to make sure no one wanted to stand with the Thibodeaux. Devereaux had people watching everything connected to Stillwater House. When Jolie appeared, and the restaurant began to change, when the books began to clean up, when customers began coming back, Devereaux's people dug into her past. It wasn't hard. One photo on Instagram, one name, a few phone calls, and everything surfaced. Jolie Fontaine, originally from Louisiana, father dead, a $14,000 debt in the name of a man called Wade Pruitt in Mobile. Devereaux called Wade. The conversation was short. The debt changed hands. Now Devereaux owned the $14,000 Jolie Fontaine owed, and he didn't need $14,000. He needed leverage, and $14,000 owed by a girl with no lawyer was perfect leverage. He came to Stillwater House on a Thursday afternoon. Alone, no lawyer, no assistant, just a man in a light gray suit and polished shoes walking into the restaurant like a customer. Because that was how Devereaux did everything. He stepped into your territory with a customer's smile and left with whatever he wanted. He sat at the center table, ordered gumbo and sweet tea, and ate slowly. Jolie served him, polite, professional. She set the plate down, asked if he needed anything else, poured water, replaced the napkin, Everything done correctly. She didn't know who he was. Not yet. When he finished eating, he called her back, his voice low and friendly, the voice of a man about to say something he had thought through very carefully. "The food is very good," he said. "You've done well here. I'd like to talk business." Then he spoke. He owned her debt. He offered 2 choices. 1. She convinced Mrs. Odette to sell Stillwater House, and the debt would disappear. The $14,000 wiped clean, and she could move on with clean hands. 2. She refused, and he would take the debt to court, freeze her assets, and drag her into a lawsuit she had no money to answer with a lawyer. He said all of this in a soft, reasonable voice, the voice of someone explaining a math problem to a child who didn't yet understand the question. Jolie listened until he finished. She stood beside the table, a water pitcher in her hand, her back straight, her face unchanged. Then she leaned down a little, just enough to speak closer, low enough that only he could hear, and said, "I've lived with that debt for 9 years. It isn't news to me, Mr. Devereaux. It's old news, and I'm tired of running." She straightened, placed the meal check on the table, face down, gently, properly, the way she would place a check for any guest. $47.50. "We don't take credit cards." Devereaux looked at her. For a long time, he wasn't used to being refused by someone who had nothing in her hands, because usually people with nothing in their hands didn't have the luxury of refusing. He placed 5 $10 bills on the table, stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked to the door without looking back. Jolie cleared the table. She picked up the money, counted it, put it in the cash box, wiped the table, and straightened the chair. Everything done correctly. Her hands didn't shake, but when she turned into the kitchen and closed the door behind her, she leaned her back against the wall and closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Because the debt was still there, and now it was in the hands of a man far more dangerous than Wade Pruitt. Croy knew about Devereaux before Jolie had even decided whether she should tell anyone. He knew because he always knew. Because even though Trent had left, there were still other people watching everything that happened around Thibodeau property, and a man in a gray suit eating lunch at Stillwater House, then speaking privately with the girl who managed the kitchen, was the kind of information that reached Croy before the day was over. He came to the restaurant at 11 o'clock at night, after the restaurant had closed, after the dining room lights had been turned off, with only the light from the back kitchen spilling through the glass door. Jolie was wiping down the stove, the last shift of the day, the shift she always did alone because she liked the kitchen when it was empty and clean, and there was only the sound of running water and the smell of soap. She heard the knock at the back door, opened it, and saw Croy standing outside in the parking lot beneath the dull yellow light, empty-handed, no other car except his parked in the corner. "Devereaux bought your debt," he said. No greeting, no opening, because Croy wasn't the kind of man who wasted the first sentence on politeness when the second sentence was the reason he had come. Jolie leaned her shoulder against the doorframe. "I know." "How much?" 14,000, maybe more with interest. Croy nodded once, as though the number had just confirmed what he already knew. "I'll pay it," he said. "One call. Done by tomorrow morning. You won't have to think about it again." He said it in a flat voice, the voice of a man used to solving everything with money because money was what he had the most of, and it was always faster than any other method. Jolie looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "No." Croy blinked. That was the most reaction Jolie had ever seen on his face. "If you pay my debt," she said, "then I owe you. And I don't want to owe anyone. Especially not you." Croy tilted his head slightly. "Why especially not me?" Jolie considered her answer for a moment, not because she didn't know, but because she was deciding what percentage of the truth to say. Then she decided to say all of it. "Because I respect you," she said, "and I want to keep it there, not turn it into obligation." That sentence hung between them in the coastal night air, between the smell of salt and cooling asphalt and the crickets singing from the grass across the road. Croy didn't answer right away. He stepped away from the door and walked toward his car. But he didn't open the door. He stopped, leaned back against the hood, and looked up at the sky, which in this region in November was so full of stars it looked as if someone had spilled salt across black cloth. Jolie stepped out after him, not coming close, only standing a few paces away, far enough to give him space, close enough to hear if he spoke softly. And he did speak softly. "I have a sister," Croy said. "Margot, 28 years old." He stopped. "She's addicted. I don't know where she is. For 2 years. I haven't known whether she's alive or not." He spoke in a voice Jolie recognized at once. The flat, quiet voice of someone who had told the story to himself too many times, the same way she had told Odette about her father the afternoon before. The same kind of voice. The same kind of pain. "I have people looking," he continued. "Good people. Expensive people. They've searched in Houston, in Memphis. No one has found her." He turned the old watch on his wrist unconsciously, the way people touch something familiar when they're talking about something they aren't used to saying aloud. "I can buy anything in this world," he said, "but I can't buy back the person I lost." He looked at Jolie. "You refuse my money because you understand that. Some things can't be bought." Jolie said nothing, not because she had nothing to say, but because there were moments when words were the most unnecessary thing you could place between two people. They stood in the parking lot of Stillwater House at 11 o'clock at night. No wine, no ceremony, no roof overhead, only asphalt and starlight and the truth. Then Croy straightened, walked toward the car door, opened it, and before getting in, he spoke without turning back. "Devereaux won't stop at the debt." "I know," Jolie said. "What are you going to do?" "The math," she said. "I'm doing the math." Croy got into the car, closed the door, and drove away. Jolie stood in the parking lot until his taillights disappeared at the end of the road. Then she went back inside, locked the door, turned off the kitchen lights, and climbed upstairs. That night, she didn't open the backpack under the bed. For the first time since Wade Pruitt walked into the restaurant, she didn't think about packing. Winter came to the Gulf Coast, not with snow, but with wind. Wind blew in from the sea, carrying a damp cold that soaked into the bones in a way no coat could stop. And the sky turned silver gray in December, and stayed that way until it decided to leave. Jolie bought an extra blanket for the upstairs room, the first thing she had bought with her own money since coming to Stillwater House, and she considered it a kind of commitment, though she didn't call it that. The call came to Croy's phone on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of December. One of his people in New Orleans, a man named Fontenot, whom Croy paid every month for one purpose only, to find Margot, called and said a young woman matching the description had been seen at a cheap motel in Treme. Croy drove 4 hours to New Orleans. When he arrived at the motel, the manager said the girl had checked out that morning. Checked out, not disappeared. Checked out, meaning she had stood at the front desk, returned the key, and walked out the front door on her own 2 feet. Sober enough to do that, alive enough to do that, but gone quickly enough that by the time Croy arrived, there was only an empty room, with wrinkled sheets and the smell of old cigarettes. Again, he drove back in the dark without calling anyone, without telling his mother, without telling any of the people who worked for him. There were things Croix Thibaudot carried alone, not because he was strong, but because he didn't know how to set them down. He drove into the parking lot of Stillwater House at nearly midnight. The restaurant had closed. The lights were off, and only a glow still spilled from the back kitchen window, where Jolie was always the last one to leave. He parked in the corner of the lot, turned off the engine, and sat there. Not going in, not leaving, not calling anyone, only sitting in the car with both hands on the steering wheel, staring into the darkness ahead without seeing anything, because what he was looking at wasn't in front of him, but inside his head, an empty room in New Orleans, wrinkled sheets, and the question he had asked himself every day for the past 2 years. Did she know he was looking? And if she knew, why did she still run? Jolie saw the car through the kitchen window while she was wiping down the last sink. She recognized Croy's car, recognized him sitting inside it, recognized that he wasn't getting out. She stood at the window for a while. Then she made a cup of coffee. Black. No sugar. She didn't know how Croy took his coffee, but she guessed. And she guessed right. Because there were people you could look at and know they drank their coffee black. She went out the back door, crossed the parking lot in the December cold, and set the cup of coffee on the hood of his car, right in front of the windshield, where he couldn't avoid seeing it. She didn't knock on the window, didn't bend down to look inside, didn't ask whether he was all right. She only set the coffee down, then turned back into the restaurant, closed the back door, turned off the kitchen light, and went upstairs. The next morning, when Jolie came down to the kitchen at 4:30, she opened the back door to let in the early air and saw the coffee cup on the hood of the car. Empty, placed back exactly where she had left it, turned upside down, the way people set a cup down when they want to say thank you without needing to say the words. The car was already gone. The parking lot was empty. No one ever mentioned that night. Not Croy, not Jolie, not ever. But from then on, whenever Jolie made morning coffee, she always made 2 cups. The storm came to the Gulf Coast in the middle of January, later than any tropical storm anyone in the region could remember, as though it had lost its way somewhere out in the Gulf of Mexico, and only then remembered it had not yet stopped by Mississippi. The forecast said Category 1 winds, nothing to worry about. The forecast was wrong. The wind came in at 3 o'clock in the morning with a force that Category 1 could not explain, tearing one corner off the restaurant roof, knocking down 2 oak trees in the parking lot, and pushing river water over the bank so far that when Jolie opened the kitchen door at 4:30 in the morning, out of habit, the water was already up to her ankles. The power was out. It had been out since 3 o'clock in the morning and would not come back for 3 days, which Jolie knew before the electric company announced it, because she had lived through enough storms in Louisiana to know that when trees fell across power lines, you counted in days, not hours. The cold storage she had just repaired 4 months earlier began to warm. One corner of the restaurant roof was open, a hole the size of a dining table, and rain poured into the dry storage room. Jolie stood in the flooded kitchen with the only pair of rubber boots she owned, and did the calculation quickly in her head. The food in cold storage would spoil within 12 hours if it was not cooked. The wet, dry goods would mold in 2 days, and the entire neighborhood around here was without power too, which meant every refrigerator in every house was warming up, which meant people would need somewhere to eat. She pulled the portable gas stove out to the front porch, the one Odette had kept in storage since last year's storm and had never used. She brought out 2 gas tanks, 3 large pots, and all the food from cold storage before it had time to spoil. Then she began to cook. Gumbo in a pot as large as a wash tub. Red rice in the pot Odette usually used when cooking for parties of 50. Cornbread made from the flour in dry storage that Jolie had saved before the rain reached it. She cooked under the porch roof with gusting wind and slanting rain, and before 8 o'clock in the morning, the neighbors began to come. No one called them. The smell of food in a storm was the only invitation needed. Croy arrived at 9 o'clock in the morning. No one had called him. He simply came, driving through water that rose halfway up the tires, parking on the higher sidewalk, and stepping out in a raincoat that looked as though he had never worn it before, because perhaps he had never needed to wear a raincoat to do the thing he was about to do. He looked at Jolie cooking on the porch, looked at the neighbors lining up with bowls and plates they had brought from home, looked at the open corner of the roof where rain was still pouring in, and he did not ask what needed to be done. He took off the raincoat, rolled up the sleeves of his shirt, and started carrying clean water containers from his car into the kitchen, folding chairs from storage out to the porch so the elderly could sit, buckets and brooms to push water off the restaurant floor, a large tarp from the back of his car to cover the torn corner of the roof. Jolie watched him pull the tarp up, while the wind shoved it back, both his hands gripping the edge of the fabric. Those long, slender hands she had first seen in the kitchen 2 months before, now red from cold and soaked with rain, holding a tarp in the wind like any pair of working hands. "Hold the left corner tight," she shouted over the wind. The winds changed direction. Croy held it. He did not ask how she knew the wind had changed. She had grown up in the bayou. She knew wind the way wind knew its own path. By instinct, by skin, by the way her hair blew to the right instead of the left, 2 seconds before the next gust came. They finished tying down the tarp. Croy swept water inside the restaurant while Jolie cooked on the porch. He asked whether the pot of rice needed more water. She said half a liter more. He asked whether the old woman sitting in the folding chair by the door needed another blanket. She said there were 2 in the storage closet. Short, practical exchanges. Like 2 people who had worked together far longer than 2 months. Like 2 people who had been through many storms together, instead of this being the first. Odette stood at the second-floor window, looking down. She did not come down because her knees would not allow her to walk through floodwater, and because there were moments when a 71-year-old mother knew the best thing she could do was stand still and watch. She watched her son carry water containers. She watched the girl she had let sleep upstairs cook for the whole neighborhood. She watched those 2 work beside each other in the rain, exchanging brief words without looking up, and she thought of her husband, Claude Thibodeau. Gone 15 years now. He had once worked beside her exactly like that too, in the early years, when the restaurant was only a small kitchen and 2 spouses, and the smell of onions frying at 4 o'clock in the morning, before the money came, before the power came, before everything became complicated. Back then, he had carried containers too, swept floors too, held tarps in the wind too, with hands that had not yet learned how to order other people to do things for him. She looked down and saw that shadow again, not in her husband, in her son. For the first time, Trent Hebert left on a Monday afternoon at the end of January, 2 weeks after the storm. There had been no warning, no buildup of arguments, no ultimatum, no look that had grown colder over many weeks. He walked into Croy's office on the upper floor of a street-front building in the business district, where Croy ran everything that had nothing to do with his mother's restaurant, closed the door, and said what he needed to say in the flat voice he had used for the past 10 years, for everything from ordering coffee to announcing that someone had just found trouble. "I followed you because you were strong," Trent said. "You're choosing to become weak. I don't follow weak men." Croy sat behind the desk and looked at Trent. 10 years. 10 years of Trent standing behind him in every room, knowing every number, every name, every agreement, the light never touched. Trent was the only person who dared tell Croy directly when he was wrong. Not because Trent was brave, but because Trent was so practical that he considered politeness a waste of time. And now that practicality stood in front of Croy and said that everything he was trying to do, separating the restaurant, legalizing each piece, pulling away from the dark roots, all of it, in Trent's eyes, wasn't change. It was weakness. "You carried water containers during the storm," Trent said, and that sentence sounded like an indictment. "You swept floors. You held a tarp. For an old woman's restaurant that almost got shut down last year." He stopped. "Do you know what people are saying? They're saying you're going soft. And when people say you're soft, Devereaux hears it. And when Devereaux hears it, he takes another step forward." Croy said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew Trent was right. At least right according to the logic both of them had lived by for the past 10 years. The logic that said, power only existed when other people believed you would use it. And when you sat down to sweep a floor, you were telling the world you were no longer standing at the top. Trent waited. Croy said nothing. Trent nodded once, the way he nodded when a negotiation had ended, and both sides knew the final terms. Then he turned, opened the door, and walked out. 10 years of loyalty ended in 3 sentences, and 1 nod. Croy sat in the office alone for a long time after Trent left. Then he drove to Stillwater House. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night. The restaurant was about to close, and only the last 2 tables of customers were still finishing their coffee. He came in through the front door, something he almost never did, and sat at the table at the far end of the room, the small table against the wall near the door to the parking lot, the table no one liked, because it was close to the walkway and caught a draft. He didn't order food, didn't call anyone over, only sat. Jolie saw him from the bar while she was ringing up the last table. She looked at him. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't ask whether he wanted to order anything. She went into the kitchen, took a bowl of gumbo, the last bowl left in the pot that day, filled it, and set it on a tray with another bowl for herself. She brought them out, placed one bowl in front of Croy, placed the other across from him, then sat down. The 2 of them ate, without speaking. The sound of spoons touching bowls, the sound of wind slipping through the crack in the door, the sound of Biscuit breathing evenly in the corner, long asleep. Not one word. And that was the most intimate meal Croy Thibodeau had shared with anyone since Margot disappeared. Not because it was romantic or profound or full of meaning, but because it didn't have to be anything. It was only 2 people eating the same dish in the same room at the end of a day when both had lost something, and neither forced the other to explain. A few days later, late in the afternoon when the kitchen had been cleaned, Odette sat at the back kitchen table with Jolie, 2 glasses of tea in front of them, and told her about Claude, her husband, Croy's father. She didn't tell much. She told enough. "He built all of this," she said, "and that all of this was larger than the restaurant, larger than Stillwater House. So wide that Jolie understood she was talking about the entire empire Croy was trying to separate piece by piece, but he built it in ways I was never proud of. I loved him, and I hated what he did. Those 2 things lived together inside me for 40 years. She lifted a hand to her chest, not dramatically, only touching lightly, as though touching the place where those 2 things still lived. "My son is not his father," she said, looking at Jolie with eyes that had seen everything a person's eyes could see in 71 years. "But he carries his father's shadow every day. That's why he's tired." Jolie listened and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. She only lifted her glass of tea and drank, and Odette drank too, and the 2 women sat in the late afternoon kitchen, with the smell of old spices in the walls and the slow turning of the ceiling fan, and that was enough. Stillwater House reopened 4 days after the storm, with the roof patched, the floor dry, the cold storage running again, and one thing no money could buy. The whole neighborhood knew its name. News of the meal served in the middle of the storm spread the way news always spread in small coastal towns. Not through newspapers or social media, but by mouth, through calls between neighbors, through remarks made in church on Sunday morning, through Mrs. Boudreaux telling her friend at the book club that little girl at Stillwater cooked gumbo for the whole neighborhood in the storm and didn't charge a cent. During the first week after reopening, the restaurant was full every night. By the second week, Jolie had to add 4 stools at the bar for guests without reservations. By the third week after reopening, she sat with Odette to review the winter books, and for the first time since Jolie had arrived, the final number at the bottom of the page wasn't red. Break even. Then February brought profit. Not much, but profit. Clean money. Every dollar that came in had an invoice. Every dollar that went out had a receipt. And the books were so transparent that if any inspector walked in to check them, Jolie could explain every line without even opening her mouth, only by handing over the ledger. That was what Jolie did differently from everyone who had ever managed this restaurant before her. She hid nothing. In the books, there were no side roads, no ghost expenses, no money coming in from somewhere no one asked about. Clean, simple. And that simplicity was the most revolutionary thing Stillwater House had ever gone through, because for the past 30 years, this restaurant's books had never been simple. They had always held lines Odette didn't look at, and numbers Claude had placed there while he was still alive, numbers that came from the other side of the Thibodeau Empire and passed through the restaurant like water through a pipe, clean at the outlet, while no one asked where it had been before it entered. Jolie shut down that pipeline. No noise, no announcement. She simply stopped accepting any money whose origin she couldn't explain. And when someone called to ask why, she said, "I don't know what this money is. If you can explain it, I'll accept it. If not, I won't." No one could explain it. No one called back. One morning in early March, when the sun had begun to warm again and the oak tree in the parking lot had started growing new buds on its broken branches, Odette sat down at the back kitchen table at 7 o'clock in the morning, just as Jolie set down 2 plates of fried eggs the way she did every morning. The 2 of them ate. Odette broke off a corner of toast, dipped it into the yolk, and chewed slowly. Then she said, in a flat, ordinary voice, as if she were saying that the weather was nice today or that the coffee was a little weak, "I met with the lawyer on Tuesday. I changed my will." Jolie stopped with her fork halfway raised. "The restaurant will belong to you when I die. All of it. The license, the brand, the recipes, everything." Odette went on without lifting her eyes from her plate of eggs. "You don't need to say anything now. Just eat your breakfast." Jolie set her fork down. She didn't cry. She didn't lift a hand to her mouth. She didn't say, "I don't deserve it," or "you shouldn't," or any of the things people usually say when they receive something too large from someone too good. She only looked at Odette. For a long time, long enough that Odette finally looked up and met her eyes. "You don't have to do that," Jolie said. "I'm not doing it because I have to," Odette said. "I'm doing it because it's right. Some things have to go where they belong. This restaurant is in the right place, for the first time in 10 years. She stopped, and in that second, her eyes softened in a way Jolie had never seen before, softened the way a 71-year-old woman looks back at everything she has held and decides it is time to send it to the place where it will be held next. "I don't want it to get lost again," she said. Then she cut another piece of egg and ate, and the morning continued like every other morning, as if what had just happened were only a small line in the long 40-year conversation between Odette Thibodeau and the restaurant she had built, kept, almost lost, and had just given away. Croy found out when he came to visit his mother at lunch the following Tuesday. Odette told him in the middle of the meal, her voice still flat, still ordinary, because she had made her decision, and Odette Thibodeau didn't explain her decisions. She only announced them. Croy looked at his mother. His mother looked back. He nodded, once, slowly, with eyes only she could read. And in that nod was everything neither of them needed to say aloud. That he understood, that he agreed, that he knew this was the right thing, even if it meant his mother had begun arranging what she would leave behind, and that meant she had begun thinking about the day she would go. Devereaux learned about the will within a week after the lawyer filed it. When the record transferring future ownership to Jolie Fontaine became a public document at the county office, Devereaux's people found it the way they found everything: quickly, quietly, and just in time for him to have a reason to act. Devereaux understood the math immediately. If the will took effect, Stillwater House would belong to a woman who owed him nothing except $14,000, a woman with no criminal past, no ties to the Thibodeau empire. Nothing at all he could use as leverage. The restaurant would be clean, truly clean. And once it was clean, he would lose the chance to buy it through pressure forever. He acted within 2 weeks. First move: sue Jolie Fontaine over the $14,000 debt, demanding an asset freeze and 9 years of interest. Second move: lobby the city council to review the revocation of Stillwater House's business license, on the grounds that the restaurant had long-standing ties to organized criminal activity, a polite way of saying the owner's son was Croix Thibodeau, and everyone knew who Croix Thibodeau was. 2 moves at the same time. If the lawsuit didn't close the restaurant, the council would. If the council didn't do it, the lawsuit would drag Jolie into court long enough to exhaust her. Devereaux didn't need to win both. He only needed one. Jolie received the court summons on Monday morning, and the notice of the council hearing on Monday afternoon of the same day. She read both, sitting alone at the back kitchen table, then folded them and placed them neatly on the table, as if folding napkins. She didn't have money to hire a lawyer. She knew that. Odette knew that. And Jolie wouldn't accept Croix's money. That much had been clear since the night in the parking lot. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She cooked. She called the city council office and invited all 5 members to dinner at Stillwater House on Thursday night, the night before the Friday hearing, free of charge. "If you're going to decide the fate of our restaurant," she said over the phone in an ordinary voice, "then at least you should know what our food is." On Thursday night, the council came. 5 people, 3 men and 2 women, walked into Stillwater House at 6 o'clock in the evening and stopped at the door, because the restaurant was full. Not full of ordinary customers, full of the neighborhood. Mrs. Boudreau, Mrs. LeBlanc, and Mrs. Parter. Guidry sat at their usual table by the window. The 3 old women Jolie had invited to try a meal 5 months earlier, and who now came every Sunday as faithfully as going to church. Mr. Trosclair sat at the bar, the shrimp seller from the morning market whom Jolie bought from every day, and whose growing grandchild she always asked after by name. The plumber's family, the man Jolie had hired during those 72 hours to help save the restaurant from closing, came with his wife and 2 children, sitting at the center table, enjoying a warm bowl of gumbo instead of just fixing pipes. Marcus, the prep cook, was serving water with the grave seriousness of a 20-year-old who understood that tonight mattered more than any night since he had started working here. And Jolene sat at the corner table beside the window, her usual table, with her little girl beside her, in front of a bowl of soup that both of them knew had never truly been left over from the kitchen. No one organized a protest. No one held a sign. No one gave a speech or shouted a slogan or wore a shirt with words printed on it. They only sat and ate. Ate food Jolie cooked with shrimp Mr. Trosclair sold, with vegetables from the morning market, with recipes she had learned in every place that had ever fired her. And when the 5 council members sat down and began asking questions, each person in the restaurant told their part. No one told them to. No one rehearsed. Mrs. Boudreau said this was the only restaurant in town that remembered she couldn't eat onions. The plumber said Jolie paid on time, the exact amount, not 1 cent short. Jolene said nothing. She only looked down at the bowl of soup in front of her daughter, then looked up at Jolie standing by the bar, and that look said more than any speech could have. The hearing the next day ended in 45 minutes. The council rejected the request to revoke the license. 5 votes in favor, none opposed. The debt lawsuit still continued in court, but Jolie had made a plan. She sat with Odette and did the math. The same math Odette had talked about months earlier. The restaurant's monthly profit, minus expenses, minus employee wages, with the remaining amount divided into gradual debt payments. 2 years, maybe 2.5. No one paid it for her. Croix didn't write a check. Odette didn't open her purse. Jolie paid it herself. Every dollar, with gumbo and red rice and cornbread, and every meal she served to every person who walked through the door she had stood outside looking into 7 months earlier. Early April morning, 4:30. The Stillwater House kitchen was still dark, with only the light from the range hood falling over the stainless steel counter. Her movements were practiced and quiet in the early morning dark, repeating the routine that began each day long before her mind had fully awakened. The vegetables had been washed the previous afternoon, arranged in baskets, and covered with damp towels in the cold storage. The stock pot had been simmering since 10 o'clock at night, pork bones and dried shrimp and bay leaves, simmering all night over the lowest flame, and now the kitchen carried a smell Jolie thought of as the smell of a place that was alive, warm, deep, the smell of something someone had been tending since before dawn. The tablecloths had been laid. She had laid them the night before after closing. 12 tables, 12 white cloths, because Jolie liked walking into the dining room in the morning and seeing everything ready, like a promise that today would come, and someone would walk through that door, sit in that chair, and eat what she cooked. 7 months ago, she had stood outside that door with worn-soled shoes and a dust-colored backpack. 7 months ago, this kitchen had oil filters caked black with residue, cold storage running over temperature, an expired permit, and the smell of a place slowly dying while no one was willing to say it aloud. Now it smelled of overnight stock and fresh shrimp from Mr. Trosclair's stall and the steady hum of the exhaust fan. And she was standing in the middle of it, as though standing inside something she had built. Not alone, not only with her own hands, but she had been here from the beginning, and she was still here now. And that alone was something she would not have believed she could have 9 years ago. The back kitchen door opened at 6:15. Jolie didn't turn around because she knew those footsteps. They had become part of the mornings at Stillwater House since winter, forming quietly without anyone naming it, without anyone making an agreement. Croy simply began arriving at 6:15, and Jolie simply began making 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, and neither of them ever mentioned it, as though mentioning it would make it official, and official things required explanation. And there were some things that lived better when no one explained them. But this morning his footsteps were different. Faster, not hurried, but purposeful, the way people walked when they were carrying something they wanted to set down. Jolie turned around. Croy stood in the kitchen doorway, with an envelope in his hand. He said nothing. He walked to the kitchen table, sat in the chair where he always sat, the chair on the left near the window, and placed the envelope on the table between them. Jolie looked at the envelope. A white envelope, wrinkled, with a coffee stain at the corner, already opened, stamped New Orleans, the handwriting on the front small and slanted, the writing of someone writing in haste, or writing with a trembling hand, or both. She looked at Croy. He nodded once. She pulled out the paper. A single line, written in blue ballpoint pen on a sheet torn from a cheap notebook, the kind sold at grocery store checkout counters. "Brother, I'm alive. I'm not ready to come home, but I'm alive." Jolie read the line twice. Then she looked up. Croy was looking at her, and in his eyes there was something she had never seen in all these months, through all the Tuesday evenings, and the coffee cup on the hood of the car, and the bowl of gumbo in the empty dining room. His eyes weren't wet. Croy Thibodeau wasn't the kind of man whose eyes went wet in front of other people, but something had changed behind those dark brown eyes, like a door that had just opened a crack after being locked tight for 2 years. Not wide open, only a crack. But a crack was enough for light to get in. And Jolie saw that light, and she understood that he had brought the envelope here, to this kitchen, at 6:15 in the morning, not because this was convenient, or because he had happened to pass by. He had brought it here because this was where he wanted to read it, and she was the person he wanted to read it with. Jolie set the paper down on the table, gently, then stood and did what she did every morning. She poured coffee. 2 cups. Black. No sugar. She placed 1 cup in front of Croy, and kept 1 for herself, then sat down again. For the first time, it was not a cup of coffee on the hood of a car in a cold parking lot, separated by a windshield. This time, they were face to face, at the same table, in the same early light slipping through the kitchen window, and she saw him take the first sip, then close his eyes for a fleeting moment, the way people close their eyes when something heavy has just been set down, even if only a little. Biscuit lay in the kitchen doorway, old, slow, his fur almost entirely gray now, his left hip aching whenever the air was damp, but still there every morning, loyal to this kitchen, and to the woman who had sat beside him at 2 o'clock in the morning on the steps months earlier, without trying to befriend him. Outside the window, the river moved through the April light, its surface glittering as though someone had scattered scraps of silver over it in the night. and the oak tree in the parking lot had grown new leaves on the branches broken by the storm, and the air smelled of wet grass and river mud and spring, the smell of something beginning again. Jolie drank her coffee and looked out the window, and didn't think about the backpack under the bed upstairs. She didn't think about Biloxi, or Mobile, or Pensacola, or Gulfport, or any of the cities she had left before dawn, with everything fitting inside one backpack. She didn't think about the road. This was the first spring in 9 years when Jolie Fontaine didn't think about leaving, and she didn't know exactly which moment the wandering had ended. Maybe it was when Odette said, "Lock the door for me," and turned away down the stairs. Maybe it was when she set the coffee on the hood of Croy's car and went back inside without knocking on the window. Maybe it was this morning, when she poured the second cup and placed it in front of a man who had just let her read the most important piece of paper in his life. She didn't know. Maybe she would never know exactly. People don't always recognize the moment when wandering ends. Sometimes only when we look back do we know. But it ends. Sometimes the place we belong is not the place where we were born, but the place where we choose to stay. This story reminds us that every person deserves to be seen for what they do today, not for what happened to them yesterday. That healing doesn't come from forgetting the past, but from finding a place worth building a future in, and that sometimes the bravest thing is not to keep running, but to stop. If this story touched something inside you, please subscribe to our channel to hear more stories every day. Press the like button so we know you're here, and share this video with the people you think need to hear it today. How do you feel about Jolie and Odette's story? Please leave a comment below, because we always want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your hearts. Every comment you write is a source of encouragement for us to keep telling stories that deserve to be told. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.